By early January 1894, 2 months after the World's Columbian Exposition had officially closed, Jackson Park was no longer a city of light, but a frozen construction site facing backward. Snow lay in ridges against the low walls around the Grand Basin. The lagoon stretched beneath a sky, the color of lead, its surface a dull sheet of ice. Inside the former Palace of Fine Arts, a building already being refitted to house the new Field Columbian Museum, workmen carried crates between galleries that still smelled faintly of plaster and wet timber. Outside, only a few arc lamps remained strung along the paths, unlit, their glass globes grey with soot. The White City, built in staff and wood and electricity, was already beginning to recede into rumour. In one makeshift office near a side entrance, an attendant sorted through a stack of large albumen prints, official views of the Court of Honour, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, the Electricity Building at night. Each photograph had been mounted on card and stamped with the year 1893. On many, captions had been written in a careful hand. On one panorama, the ink line below the image stopped halfway, Grand Basin, and then nothing. The space for words remained blank. The buildings reflected in the water domes, colonnades, the gilded statue of the Republic were already gone from the landscape outside. Officially, these prints were records of a temporary achievement. Yet the photographs showed something else, structures whose proportions and axial symmetry echoed older capitals, a field of domes and towers aligned along a central basin, wired with a new, humming power grid. Later, some speculative writers would look at these same images and see not a temporary fair, but the faint after-image of an older, erased pattern, a vocabulary of water, domes, and electric light that seemed too coherent to be a one-time spectacle. Official history insists that the White City was a plaster illusion. The photographs and the silence of that unfinished caption leave room for a different question. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. By May the 1st, 1893, when the World's Columbian Exposition finally opened to the public, Jackson Park and the Midway Plaisance had been remade into a 690-acre landscape of lagoons, avenues, and nearly 200 neoclassical buildings. The Court of Honour around the Grand Basin, with its white facades and the colossal statue of the Republic, quickly became known as the White City, a term that referred both to its whitewashed surfaces and to the unprecedented blaze of electric lights that illuminated it at night. The official guidebooks describe the buildings as temporary fronts of staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fibre, cast over wooden frames and painted to resemble marble. Architecture critics called them decorated sheds, theatrical scenery erected for a single season. Yet photographs taken that summer show deep cornices, colonnades, and domes whose shadows fall with the weight of stone. The contradiction is less in the materials than in the effect, a provisional city that looked, in images, like an established capital. Visitors who arrived that opening week stepped off trains at the terminal station and moved along broad avenues laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted and Daniel Burnham. Water, not streets, organized the composition. The Grand Basin at the center, flanked by the Administration Building, Machinery Hall, the Agriculture and Manufactures Buildings, and the Electricity Building, all reflecting in still water. The hum that threaded through the scene was new, the low, continuous vibration of alternating current generators, transmitted along cables to arc lamps and incandescent bulbs. One contemporary observer wrote simply that the illumination at night made a fairy city of the grounds, a phrase often repeated in later accounts. The calendar showed May 1893. The dedication ceremonies had been held months earlier, on October the 21st, 1892. That dual chronology dedicated in one year, opened in another, became the first subtle timestamp tension. By June 1893, the public narrative of the fair had settled into place. Newspapers emphasized attendance numbers, national pavilions, and the triumph of American engineering. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, with its unprecedented iron trusses, and a floor area often described as the largest in the world, housed industrial displays. Machinery Hall, equally vast, staged what guidebooks called a congress of engines, dynamos, steam engines, compressors, and a forest of belts and shafts. The Electricity Building, fronting the Court of Honor, was the visible face of a deeper technical conflict. Inside, Westinghouse Electric, using patents by Nikola Tesla, demonstrated a polyphase alternating current system, generators, step-up transformers, transmission lines, and induction motors arranged as a working network. At night, over 90,000 lamps around the fairgrounds blazed with alternating current power, a public demonstration staged in the middle of what journalists would later call the War of Currents. Official reports framed this as proof that electric power could be safely transmitted over distance. A visitor listening to the whine of dynamos and the rhythmic thump of steam engines could hear, in literal vibration, the tuning of a new industrial frequency. Those same sounds whir, and the faint crackle of arc lamps would recur throughout the fair and in subsequent expositions around the world. The materials of the White City, however, remained stubbornly ephemeral. Staff could be sprayed onto facades using compressed air, then carved into elaborate ornament and painted. It was fast and cheap, but it did not weather well. Proposals were floated to rebuild key structures in permanent materials after the fair, but the economics of the 1893 Depression and later fires would end those plans. A small tension in the record appears in the way these buildings were described. Brochures emphasized their temporary nature, yet souvenir photographs often presented them without that qualifier. On October the 9th, 1893, Chicago Day drew a record-breaking crowd of more than 750,000 people to the White City. The Inter-Ocean and other newspapers celebrated the moment as a civic climax, proof that Chicago had recovered from the 1871 fire and joined the ranks of world cities. Band music, fireworks, and the glow of electric lights over the Grand Basin made the Court of Honor appear almost overexposed in surviving nighttime photographs, the reflections of the facades vibrating in the water like a second inverted city. The official closing came on October the 30th, 1893. Ceremonies marked the end of the fair. Flags were lowered. Some exhibits began to be packed, yet the physical city did not vanish overnight. Accounts and images from late 1893 and early 1894 still show buildings standing, their white surfaces gradually streaked by winter weather. One headline months later would speak of the White City in flames, acknowledging that it took fire, not simply a date on a program, to erase the structures. For many visitors, the closing period was colored by a different story, running parallel to the official narrative: the economic panic of 1893 and rising labor unrest. Just south of Jackson Park, the company town of Pullman was sliding toward the strike that would erupt in 1894. Inside the fairgrounds, however, the music continued to play. The great pipe organ in one of the music halls, with over 3,900 pipes and electrical connections between keys and valves, provided a different kind of hum, a controlled resonance, tuned by hand. One observer later recalled that as the fair closed, the lights went out one by one over the basin. Whether that exact staging occurred as remembered or as a composite memory remains uncertain. The official record ends on October the 30th, yet the physical erasure unfolded in stages. By January the 8th and 9th, 1894, a cold front had frozen Jackson Park solid. On those dates, a fire broke out in the casino building near the peristyle at the lakefront, spreading rapidly through the empty fair structures. Newspapers carried headlines that spoke of the White City in flames, noting with a kind of grim fascination that the same grounds that had celebrated the conquest of fire through steel and stone were now reduced again to embers. After the fire, photographs show blackened skeletal frames, collapsed roofs, and piles of rubble along the lagoon. Yet in some images, taken later in the 1890s and early 1900s, low concrete and stone foundations remain at the water's edge, long after the staff facades have vanished. These platforms, steps, and retaining walls more durable than the fair's supposed temporary skins had to be substantial enough to resist water and frost. Their continued presence forced later engineers to dredge and clear channels through what park records described as the wreckage of the exposition to reopen the waterways. Official documentation describes the fair buildings as temporary and their foundations as part of routine civil works. Without mystery, the tension lies not in any hidden blueprint, but in the visual impression left by photographs, a layered landscape in which some elements, domes, columns, statues disappear, while others, steps, platforms, quay walls linger as unacknowledged infrastructure. The recurring motif shifts from light to weight. The sound is no longer the hum of dynamos, but the dull echo of boots and tools on surviving stone. A park commissioner's remark that harbour channels had to be cleared through exposition debris hints at the practical afterlife of these foundations. Some speculative writers look at these remnants and see the outline of a more permanent plan beneath the temporary fair. Mainstream historians attribute the contrast simply to different lifespans of materials. The foundations keep their own counsel, absorbing the sound of waves against stone. On July the 10th, 1893, months before the fair closed, a different fire tore through the structure called the greatest refrigerator on Earth, the cold storage building near the fairgrounds, a Romanesque structure that housed an ice rink and demonstrated large-scale artificial refrigeration. During a test of its equipment, flames broke out in the tower, trapping firefighters who had climbed in on ropes and hoses. 12 firefighters and several civilians died as thousands watched, one of the worst fire tragedies in Chicago's history. The cold storage building's fire alarm and bells rang out above the general noise of Machinery Hall and the Midway, an acoustic shock cutting through the hum of engines. In later safety reports, the design of the structure and the placement of the fire brigade's ladders would be analysed in technical terms. For our purposes, the episode introduces another motif, sound as warning, a bell that rings not in celebration, but in failure. The cold storage fire occurred in the same summer that the fair presented itself as a triumph over chaos. The contradiction between spectacle and catastrophe is fully documented. The date creates a second layer of tension. The cold storage fire took place on July the 10th, during the peak operating months of the fair. Yet many retrospective accounts of the Columbian Exposition focus on its opening in May and its closing at the end of October, treating the period in between as a continuous success. The July fire interrupts that smooth narrative with a documented rupture, a literal burning within the City of Light. Alternative history readings sometimes seize on this event as emblematic, a refrigeration temple turned furnace, an early industrial complex in which control of temperature and energy slipped in an instant. The only surviving artifact from the blaze was a copper statue of Columbus, preserved as a monument to the dead. The recurring acoustic motif here is the bell, first the clangor of alarm, then silence. Later in the story, other bells and chimes would reappear as more ambiguous symbols of resonance and memory. By late summer 1893, guidebooks, panoramic maps, and souvenir albums of official views circulated widely. One could walk through the fair with a bird's-eye map in hand, tracing a path from the administration building across the Court of Honor to the fisheries, the mines and mining building, and the distant Ferris wheel on the Midway. Large format photographs by C. D. Arnold and others documented the facades, interiors, and crowds. On the maps, each building is labelled and numbered. In many albums, each image bears a caption. The archival tension emerges not from missing information, but from the way certain forms repeat without commentary. Domes recur. The great dome of the administration building, the dome of the Fine Arts Palace, the drum and cupola of Festival Hall, each slightly different in scale and ornament, but sharing a vocabulary of circular plans and coffered interiors. In at least one surviving description of the Court of Honor by moonlight, writers emphasize how the domes and colonnades reflected in the Grand Basin created a sense of doubled architecture, solids above, shimmering inversions below. Yet the captions rarely comment on the acoustic consequences of these shapes. A dome, by its nature, focuses sound. A colonnade along water creates repeating echoes. Contemporary accounts of music in Festival Hall and the open plazas speak of superb acoustics and the carrying power of bands and choirs, but do not frame this as anything other than good design. The date tension in this chapter arises from later reproductions. An 1893 map might be reprinted in a 1900 souvenir book, its caption unchanged. A photograph of the Court of Honor labelled 1893 might be used decades later to illustrate an article on the fair, compressing past and present into a single static view. The domes become detached from precise time. Speculative readers of these images sometimes note the alignment of domes and water as part of a broader pattern. Late 19th century expositions in Chicago, Paris, and St. Louis all built temporary cities whose central axis involved a reflecting basin flanked by classical architecture. Whether this repetition suggests an inherited template or simply the influence of Beaux-Arts training remains debated. The images themselves offer only their silent geometry. On July the 5th, 1894, more than 8 months after the fair closed, a massive fire swept through what remained of the White City. It was the fourth and largest fire to strike the fairgrounds. Accounts indicate that strikers from the nearby Pullman Works, amid the broader national labor conflict, set parts of the abandoned buildings ablaze. Flames consumed large sections of the Court of Honor and adjacent structures in a matter of hours. Contemporary photographs show a sequence: first the elegant facades, then smoke rising behind them, then finally skeletal iron frames against a curtain of flame. The administration building, the mines and mining building, the electricity building, and others were gutted in a matter of hours. One article described the scenes as wiping out in a night what it had taken years to raise, underlining the speed of erasure. The date July the 5th, 1894, stands in quiet conflict with the official closing date of October the 30th, 1893. For some purposes, the fair ended in October. For others, its visible form persisted until that summer night. The White City had, in effect, a ghost period, months when its buildings stood deserted, used by squatters, or simply left to wind and snow, before labor unrest and fire completed their demolition. The recurring motif here is not the steady hum of alternating current power, but the roar of uncontrolled combustion, a grim echo of Chicago's 1871 fire, and a reminder that the city's self-narrative of mastery over fire remained fragile. For later speculative readers, the deliberate burning of the White City by angry workers becomes a symbolic act, the destruction of a planned, ordered space by those excluded from its promises. For those interested in lost technologies, the practical consequence is more concrete. Archives, models, and components of machinery were destroyed. Some blueprints and technical descriptions survive. Others may have perished in those flames. That loss is documented, though often in general terms. Act 2 ends with this reflection. The White City did not simply decay, it was actively burned. If the photographs serve as its afterimage, the fires of 1894 set the exposure time. During the fair's operating months in 1893, most visitors would have understood the illumination of the White City as the work of Westinghouse Electric, explained in guidebooks and signage as an alternating current lighting system that had defeated a rival bid by Edison's direct current General Electric. They might have seen rows of dynamos in the power plant, cables running toward the Court of Honor, and banks of lamps in the electricity building. A smaller number, those who ventured into the Westinghouse exhibit rooms, encountered something more esoteric. There, demonstrations based on Nikola Tesla's patents displayed polyphase induction motors, high-frequency transformers, and his famous Egg of Columbus, a copper egg spun upright by a rotating magnetic field created by polyphase coils. Tesla himself visited the fair in August, presenting wireless lighting experiments in a darkened room where gas-discharged lamps glowed in his hand without wired connections. The official record treats these demonstrations as part of the public education in electricity. The Bureau of Electricity, the International Electrical Congress, and trade publications describe the polyphase system in practical engineering language, phases, voltages, and efficiencies. The deeper sensory impression for those who attended, however, was of a new kind of invisible field, a hum not only of sound, but of unseen lines of force. The date tension in this chapter appears between August 1893, when Tesla's demonstrations took place, and later retellings of the Columbian Exposition in which his role is sometimes minimized or magnified, depending on the narrator. The fair itself did not name a single protagonist. It presented devices and systems without anchoring them in one personality. Speculative readings from alternative history perspectives interpret the combination of electric fields, water basins, and aligned architecture as more than coincidence. In that view, the Grand Basin becomes a kind of resonant cavity, the domes and towers acting as collectors or distributors of subtle energy. Mainstream historians do not support such interpretations. They see a deliberate but conventional composition of Beaux-Arts urbanism, illuminated by modern power. The archival evidence supports the latter, but the visual pairing of hum and reflection remains difficult to dismiss entirely. Music at the Columbian Exposition was not incidental. It was planned. Two major music buildings, Music Hall and Festival Hall, were constructed, the latter with a dome 145 feet in diameter on a cylindrical base, seating around 4,000 people with standing room for thousands more. The stage was reportedly larger than that of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. Inside these halls, orchestras, choirs, and soloists performed works ranging from European symphonies to newly composed pieces celebrating the fair. A giant pipe organ, with thousands of pipes controlled by electric connections from the console, could fill the hall with sound. Electrical relays translated key presses into valve movements. The instrument itself formed a hybrid of acoustics and electromagnetism. Contemporary reports from the Bureau of Music and attendees frequently mention the remarkable acoustics of these spaces. Notes carried clearly to distant seats. Choral textures remained intelligible under the dome. Climatic conditions, Chicago's humid summers, the temperature differences between day and night would have affected tuning. Yet the overall impression was of a total environment, visual grandeur aligned with sonic clarity. The date tension here lies between the 6 months of 1893, when these performances took place, and the rapid disappearance of the halls themselves. By 1894, Festival Hall and Music Hall were gone. The scores live on in archives. Some instruments survive, but the exact acoustic behavior of those domes, how a particular chord would have hung under the coffered ceiling, exists now only in descriptions. Speculative observers draw a line between these resonant architectures and older domed spaces used for liturgy and ceremony. Byzantine churches, Ottoman mosques, European cathedrals, arguing that the Columbian Exposition compressed a long tradition of sound-focused design into a temporary stage. Academic historians instead trace the lineage through Beaux-Arts schools and the revival of classical forms. The acoustic continuity, however, is real. A human voice under a dome behaves similarly whether the dome is permanent stone or temporary staff. The recurring motif is echo, the way a single note, struck on organ or sung by choir, returns milliseconds later from curved surfaces. The original dome's precise frequency response is lost, but the idea that architecture can tune sound remains embedded in both scientific and speculative traditions. Among the many sounds that filled the fair, bells occupied a special niche. The Daughters of the American Revolution organized the casting of a Columbian Liberty Bell intended to ring at the exposition, inscribed with the names of United States, states and territories, and imagined as a unifying national symbol. Musical instrument exhibits in the fair included chimes and carillons. At least one catalogue of instruments lists chimes and bell ringers among the displays. The combination of bells, chimes, and a city of domes around a reflecting basin creates a specific soundscape, metal tones carrying across water, reflections doubling not only images, but also delayed echoes. Descriptions of the Court of Honor by night emphasize its visual splendor, but the scene must also have held an acoustic texture, the distant clanging of a bell marking the hour, the shouts of boatmen on the lagoon, the low rumble of machinery behind facades. The time-stamp tension here is subtle. The Columbian Liberty Bell itself did not become as central to popular memory as the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Its sound was particular to 1893, yet its physical bell continued to exist after the fair, moving through subsequent decades with less fanfare. The fair's own bells, fire alarms, chimes, and clocks ceased to ring once the buildings were gone. Some later commemorations of the White City include visual references to its domes and colonnades, but omit any mention of bells. Speculative interpreters focus on bells as resonant devices, capable of structuring not only time, but also space through vibration. In their reading, the arms race of 19th century industry, bigger bells, larger organs, more powerful dynamos, constitutes a rediscovery in metal and current, of an older knowledge about frequency and human perception. Academic accounts document the instruments, their makers, and their cultural roles, but do not ascribe hidden functions to them. The archival record supports the musical and ceremonial uses. Anything beyond that remains speculation, explicitly labeled as such. The recurring motif here is resonance, the way metal, air, and human bodies respond to periodic vibration. In the context of the White City, that resonance was an overlay on an environment already charged with electromagnetic fields and reflected light. What remains factual is that, for 6 months in 1893, a landscape of domes, water, electricity, and bells existed on the south shore of Lake Michigan and was then physically erased. After the fair closed and the fires of 1894 swept away much of the White City, one major building remained in Jackson Park, the Palace of Fine Arts. Built more solidly than the staff-clad pavilions, with brick and a fireproof construction beneath its classical exterior, it was converted into the Field Columbian Museum in 1894, housing collections assembled for the fair. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the structure was rebuilt in more permanent materials and reopened in 1933 as the Museum of Science and Industry. Its Ionic colonnades, central dome, and long galleries survive today as one of the few physical links to the 1893 exposition. Standing in its main hall now, under electric lighting and surrounded by industrial exhibits, a visitor occupies the same volume of space that once held paintings, sculptures, and international art treasures. The date tension here runs across decades. The original Palace of Fine Arts was completed for 1893, repurposed in 1894, remodeled in the early 20th century, and reopened in a drastically different guise in 1933. Each layer adds to the building's identity: Fair Pavilion, Museum of Natural History, Science Museum. Yet many casual visitors today are unaware that the building is a survivor of the White City at all. Interpretive panels mention the connection. The architecture whispers it more eloquently in stone. The recurring motif returns to echo. Voices sound differently in this hall than they did under staff facades, but the proportions still shape them. For speculative observers, the building's persistence suggests that certain nodes in the 1893 layout were too valuable to erase completely, whether for symbolic, functional, or logistical reasons. Mainstream explanations point to practical factors: the palace's more durable construction and its suitability for museum use. The archival evidence clearly supports those reasons. Any additional meaning must remain a hypothesis. The silence between what was planned and what survived continues to resonate. Elsewhere in Jackson Park, 2 other remnants tie the present landscape to the erased city. On the wooded island, the Garden of the Phoenix, a Japanese garden originally established in 1893 as the site of the Ho-Oh Den, or Phoenix Pavilion, continues to mark the former location of one of the fair's most admired international exhibits. The original pavilion, modelled on the Phoenix Hall of Byodo in Uji, Japan, burned in the 1940s, but the garden has been restored and renamed, with views back toward the Museum of Science and Industry. Near the intersection of East Hayes Drive and South Richards Drive stands the gilded bronze statue of the Republic, a one-third scale replica of the colossal statue that once dominated the Court of Honor. Installed in 1918 to commemorate both the fair's 25th anniversary and Illinois statehood, the smaller statue occupies approximately the same site as its predecessor, now adjacent to a golf course. These objects carry multiple dates: 1893 for the original Phoenix Pavilion and the original plaster statue of the Republic, 1918 for the replica statue, 2013 for the renaming of the Garden of the Phoenix. The land remembers through overlapping chronologies. Visitors strolling the park might see only a Japanese-style garden and a golden figure, unaware of the layered history beneath their feet. The recurring motif here is reflection visually in the lagoon, temporally in the way replicas and restorations echo lost originals. Both academic history and speculative narratives agree that these markers point back to 1893, to a city no longer present. The difference lies only in how one interprets their persistence, as commemoration, as trace, or as something else entirely. The water still reflects the sky above them, as it did when the White City stood. In the early 21st century, Jackson Park is a complex landscape of golf courses, lagoons, bird habitats, sports fields, and the emerging Obama Presidential Center. Only a few markers indicate that it was once the site of the White City. The Museum of Science and Industry, the Garden of the Phoenix, and the Statue of the Republic are the most prominent reminders. Otherwise, much of the former fairground lies under grass, trees, and paths. A visitor today might stand on a flat stretch of turf near the current golf course and, with the help of an 1893 map, realize that they are approximately on the former axis of the Court of Honor, where electric lights once traced the outlines of colonnades and domes. The wind over the lagoon carries only the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic on Lakeshore Drive, the hum of dynamos, the ring of the Columbian Liberty Bell, and the murmur of crowds are gone. The date tensions pile up here: the park's current projects, habitat restoration in the wooded island, the construction of new cultural centres carry timelines of their own. Meanwhile, the memory of 1893 is periodically revived by books, documentaries, and tours. The White City exists now primarily as an image and a story, a city more fully present in archives than in stone. Speculative frameworks read these traces as evidence of deliberate erasure, a demonstration city built over deeper foundations, illuminated by reactivated technology, and then burned before its implications could be grasped. Academic history sees a World's Fair that embodied the aspirations and contradictions of the Gilded Age, then fell victim to neglect, fire, and changing priorities. The recurring motif in this closing chapter is static, a kind of imagined archival noise, overlaying the present-day soundscape. Photographs fade at the edges, prints yellow, some negatives have been lost. Yet enough material survives to reconstruct, with reasonable accuracy, the fair's layout, technologies, and aesthetics. What does not survive, and perhaps never can, is the full lived sensation of walking through that city at night, under electric light, with the low hum of machinery and the echo of music under domes. The story loops back to the opening archival room, prints being sorted, captions partly written, a city reduced to images. If architecture is a language, Chicago's White City spoke in a dialect heard only once. The record tells us what was said, the silence that followed hints at what was not. The lagoon at dusk still catches the last light. Somewhere beneath the grass and concrete lie the foundations of a city that existed for half a year, then was systematically burned, dismantled, and overwritten. The soundtrack hums faintly, not with dynamos, but with the quiet noise of history itself, an unresolved vibration between progress and erasure.